Shalom, Erev Tov, and that is the best I can do, but it is very nice to meet you. I'm glad to be out here at your beautiful city and at your beautiful conference. And as she mentioned, I'm with Logs.io, and I work with them, and we work on the Elk stack. So if you want to know any more about Logs and Elk, please feel free to find me or any of my coworkers that are scattered in the audience. But to get right started, normally what I do at this point, since we've been kind of chugging way through the conference, is I actually ask everyone to stand up and just give a stretch to put us all in the right mindset of what we're going to be talking about. So you want to just, yeah? Thank you. So part of the reason for that is when we're talking about monitoring noise, it's usually a slow uptick to the noise, right? We don't design monitoring systems to annoy us. We design monitoring systems to help us. But even something as simple as attending an event for a whole day, you don't even realize that you're just slowly, it just starts to wear on you. And to get right into what that looks like that. So who here has worked at a startup? Who here has worked at a place where you inherited something legacy, something older and brittle? Were they noisy? Did you trust what you were protecting in your infrastructure? And by that I mean, did you feel confident that you could turn down the noise and not miss something critical? Dearth of hands. Excellent. So when we try to know everything, and I ran into this issue at a prior startup I worked at where we had this situation where we're very underpowered, as you are, and because we were working on an environment that there was minimal trust on the engineering side, where we were like, okay, we just need to know everything, we ran into this situation, we started getting pinged for everything. Be careful what you wish for. And so the result of all of that is that people would start to mute the notification services. For example, if you do Slack ops, they might say, you know what, in order to get work done, I need to close Slack. Or they might do other things that are being muted, you know, SMS or however you have that configured. And once that starts to happen, you actually do start to miss critical alerts because you've made them all the same level of noisiness. And it's worth mentioning, I mean, production systems hiccup all the time, and sometimes it doesn't actually matter. They hiccup, they recover, and you don't actually need to take action on that. And in that case, do you really want it to be as loud as a 20-minute outage? You probably don't. But then there's the trust problem. If you're used to a noisy system and you suddenly start taking down the noise, do you trust the quiet that you've just created? Do you believe that it's quiet because you've told it to be quiet, or do you believe that it's quiet because there's actually not a problem? So the goal is to find a medium where you can actually create a space of silence in your monitoring system that doesn't actually drive you stir crazy. And to get a little bit into that, and part of the reason I had us all stretch, is the cost of noise. Noise isn't all about monitoring. You know, sometimes you have the background noise of just existing in a public space. You go out to dinner, there's music, there's maybe other conversations, you might hear someone over here. Maybe you live with family or a spouse and they have an interest that you do not share, but yet suddenly you find that you're almost an expert on the topic, yet you've never cracked a book or listened to a podcast about it. And that's just because they've been existing in your space. You haven't necessarily been actively listening to them that whole time. They've been doing other things. But your brain is still processing that data. We're still wired to process our background. While we're processing our background, we lose a lot of time. There was a study done by UC Irvine where they actually have people basically mimic what it's like to have a walk-up. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're sitting around doing your Kubernetes or whatever your PaaS of du jour is, and Joe developer walks up and just says, what's the Wi-Fi password? And you give it to him, and he walks away. And by that I mean it's a task that is simple, that you can address immediately, that you do not actually have to redirect. It's not an outage where you're changing what you're working on. That is where you're losing 25 minutes every time. Because you're changing state, you're losing the place, you're losing the mental model you've been building in your head on what you've been working on. And now the time lost is redirecting back to the task you're working on, going through the steps that you were just working on, and actually getting into roughly the same state you were in when you were interrupted. How many of you have been interrupted during your workday? About short things. Right, and it's almost inescapable, right? Because people, you're the engineer or similar role, people see you as a knowledgeable person. They're going to ask you things. So be careful and be mindful when they're asking you things, it's actually costing you time and maybe not in the immediately obvious sense. You can try to address this problem by multitasking, but the results aren't great. When you're multitasking, you actually lose a lot of quality. And they actually did a test with this on another study. And we have a test in the US called the AP exam, which is university entrance exams. And what they basically did is in the essay portion of this exam, they gave them the essay, and then they had a group of students that they were interrupting to see what would happen. And what happened was the quality of the essays dropped quite significantly. So these tests are scored 0 to 5. And the scores on average dropped by about half a point. So on that scale, half a point is actually very significant. And you can see, and this is a sketch, but when someone's not paying attention or trying to rush their way through something, when you're trying to multitask so that you can continue working on Kubernetes while Joe's asking the Wi-Fi password, you might actually introduce errors into something that you're building. There's another cost to multitasking as well. And when you're looking at error rate, so sometimes it's not something as obvious as the overall quality degradation of a final product. Sometimes it's as simple as just introducing tiny errors like typos. And this is something that was found in yet a separate study. And by the way, I'll be showing all these on a slide toward the end. They basically had someone doing a very simple repetitive task. Think of it like writing lines over and over, same sentence. And then they were interrupting them and noticed that their error rate tripled. So when you're talking about interruptions and multitasking and you're like, I need to write code, I need to modify this bug, that's the kind of error rate that you're looking at if you're trying to do this day in, day out, just getting through your workday. So now that we know that noise is really kind of awful for all of us, we're just not wired to handle it, what do we do about it? If you're talking about the noise exclusively in production systems, we're looking at being aware of where your noise is coming from. And this goes back to what I mentioned earlier, and I'll be covering more, is you have to know your sources of noise. If you have a system that's noisy, know that that system is noisy. Figure out why it's noisy. Categorize it. Is every single bit of that configuration noisy? Is it just the network chatter? Is a certain drive, if you have an on-prem, error prone, maybe it needs to be replaced and that sort of thing, and then you start to actually pay attention, and maybe there's a way that you can slim that down. As an example of a very simple setup, this is how noise gets out of hand very quickly. So here we just have Atlassian, which is your Jira, Confluence, whatever. You have Elastic or your, logging source of preference. You have Slack, you have Gmail, right? And all these systems are hooked up together and talking to each other. But you also have yourself on the side as well. How many of you get messages from home throughout the day? I think some of you might be sleepy. I'm sure that only a third of you. I'm sure it's more than a third. But my point is you're getting messages from home during the workday as well. And if you're not muting those, then you're not only getting distracted in the workplace by coworkers or by actual issues that you're addressing in AWS, Azure, or however, you're actually distracting yourself and making yourself kind of your own worst enemy there. Any sort of social media or anything that might be lighting up your phone or lighting up your laptop if you've connected the two. That will actually make it much harder for you to go through your workday when you're already trying to combat distractions that are work relevant. Some things that you can do to help this, not just at home but also at work, is to make sure you're communicating to those around you. How many people feel that they would benefit from being able to set time aside where they're actually doing whatever they consider their actual job to be? How will other people know what time you've dedicated to that if you don't tell them? Ooh, how many people wear their headphones when nothing's playing to... Yeah. I feel like that's a known enough trick that people just walk up anyway at this point, right? So you do things in your space to try and deter people from entering it when you're trying to focus, but unless you're actually just directly telling them what you're up to or putting maybe a little sign up, depending on whether you're not in an open floor plan or however you have it working, people don't know. And if you're wearing headphones, I think we can all assume that people have dead air headphones on. I mean, we've all done that. Make sure you're setting an example of what an actual emergency is. For example, you don't want your coworkers to not come to you or not feel comfortable coming to you if there's a legit emergency that you don't know about just because you've made this very aggressive space, right? Because that's actually counterproductive in the opposite direction. So make sure you set boundaries of what your expectation of what emergent means and tell them how long it's going to be, 1 hour, 4. And then they know not to bother you, and then they can help you keep your space and protect your time. But going back to production, when you're categorizing your noise, sometimes you'll find situations, especially in startups and legacy systems, that are either being spun up very quickly or everyone's afraid to touch, depending on where you're at. You're going to find that your noise actually isn't necessary. And when you start categorizing what might not be necessary, for example, if you have false positives, it's creating noise that's not actionable because it's not actually anything. If you have false negatives, you're getting a vacuum when you don't want one. If you have something that's fragile, it's just going to spam you to death whether you like it or not. And these are all things that you can start to categorize. Going back to what I mentioned earlier about if you have an on-prem and you have a disk that's throwing errors all the time, well, maybe just look at the disk instead of muting the error source. And that way you can prevent yourself from missing errors from other mechanisms coming through that way. It's also important to make sure that you're keeping track of who needs to know things, right? I'm going to jump on a ledge here and say, how many of you are involved in DevOps or SRE type of workflow? Okay. How would you feel if you got a notification for something about a button not working on your landing page? Would you feel that you could take action on that item that just appeared on your phone? Probably not, right? That's not something that falls under your workflow. Similarly, if you're the designer for the web page and everybody has to be in PagerDuty or VictorOps or whatever your preference is, they're not going to be able to do anything either. So noise control goes both ways. You need to make sure that it's going to the appropriate engineers or engineering teams, and you need to make sure that's not any louder than it needs to be. If there's not an outage, I don't want my phone, true life example, I don't want my phone going off at 4 o'clock in the morning because my database is not using enough memory, ? Someone did actually configure that for whatever reason. Apparently, the thought behind that was maybe something's wrong in the database if it's not using enough resources. But there were no other indications of an outage, right? So after that happened, we had a conversation about what actually an outage looks like so that we could actually monitor those things instead of guessing about, oh, well, maybe everybody's asleep because it's 4 a.m. And that helps everyone protect their time and their sleep so that we can go through our workday. And with all this talk about slimming down, I feel like it's important to mention that sometimes you need to introduce a little extra flexibility into your setup. And I pick on Slack a little bit just because they're mostly reliable. So, I feel half bad about it. I don't know how many of you were working last June in the summer, but they actually had a 3-hour outage. And on the United States side, we actually felt it pretty noticeably because it was right in the middle of our workday. And it's not uncommon for startups to, plug lots of notifications into Slack. And if you don't have a way to flex those endpoints to switch to email or something else, if you have an outage, when your notification source has an outage, you're going to rely on human reporting. How many people like to wait until a user reports an outage to find out that it even exists? Does that sound like a good time? I agree. It does not sound like a good time. So make sure that when you're testing your resources, you're also testing your mechanisms. Make sure Slack is reliable now, and that could change tomorrow. And if it changes tomorrow, I need to be able to work around that, and I need to be able to change my setup so that my company or my business or my workflow doesn't suffer because I'm completely locked into a tool that has just gone. This also goes back to avoiding the anxious Squidward back on the earlier slides. Because going back to silence, if you don't trust the silence, if you go through all this work and you create all these workflows and you eliminate all of this noise, if you are not confident that you've successfully only eliminated legitimate noise, you're going to worry about missing things. And if you don't trust that your silence means that everything's fine, you're actually going to find that you're even more anxious in the silence than the noise. So make sure that you're checking those tools, like I mentioned. Make sure that you're doing any sort of duplication that might be needed. For example, if a team is using a chat app, but not everyone in the company is using a chat app, you might need to notify other aspects of the business depending on the severity of a situation. You need a mechanism in place to make sure that happens. You also need to make sure, I would recommend doing it actually pretty often. I usually recommend actually integrating it into your sprint cadence or whatever version of that is relevant for you. And the reason I say this is because how many people make changes to their product, APIs, etc., more than once a week? How likely do you think, or even once a month, Serious product changes? Really? I was expecting more than that. When you're making serious product changes, let's say that you have an alert checking maybe for a heartbeat or an availability, and you change what that endpoint looks like or where it exists. All of a sudden, you're going to have an alarm going off all the time, but there's nothing actually wrong. You just haven't updated it yet. Or if you do a major product shift, release a new service even, you might find out that you're alerting on things that aren't even active anymore that you've deprecated. And that's also not useful to you, because if you've deprecated it, if it's about to go offline, depending on business case, you might not need to know. And the only way to keep your monitoring system in pace with all of these changes is to actually keep them in pace with the changes. When you're making changes, make sure that you're checking your monitoring so that your monitoring is in alignment. Also make sure that every time an alert goes off, you're checking whether or not it's actually relevant. And this goes back to keeping your monitoring system clean regardless, right? Once you go through the major overhaul and you clean up your monitoring system, if you have to do a dedicated time to that, after you want to do that, you don't want to do that again. You don't want to spend like weeks or months working on a monitoring system. And the way to avoid that is to say, okay, every time it goes off, did it resolve? Did I fix it? Did I permanently fix it? Can I delete it? And you need to get comfortable deleting it. This is the resource slide I mentioned before if anyone wants to take a picture for additional reading, including the studies I referenced. Also, if anyone wants to find the posted slides, that's where they are. Thank you very much for your time. And does anyone have any questions?